Okie dokie, so welcome back. This is now clip number 2 on the chapter 2 for your textbook on employment stuff. I took this from this book called Labor Market Economics, and they had this sort of sidebar discussion, which I thought was just so fascinating when I saw it. It's basically here in their chapter 17, page 512, 513 of this book. I just want to quickly cover this. It's just sort of, I thought, very, very fascinating when I read this for the first time. And so I'm going to read this to you quickly. It says, recognizing that there is no single best measure of unemployment suitable for all purposes. Okay? Because there's, there can be different ways of how do we define who is in the labor force. Right, like for instance, do we include people who are in prison? Do we include people who are in the army or the military? So, what is unemployed? How long does one have to be searching before they can be considered in the unemployment ranks? What do we do with people who are temporarily laid off? Stuff like this. It's all these sort of nuances and so on. That's why they're doing this. Statistics Canada produces a number of supplementary measures of unemployment. Okay, so for instance, they're basing this on the 1998 statistics. So this book's a little bit dated. My goodness, it's almost 10 years old. Wow. Anyway, and these can range from what they call the R1 measure of 1.1% to R8 of 11.5%. When the official rate, which is also called R4, equals 8.3%. So if someone ever says to you, this is the unemployment rate, or if you ever read that in any articles, right, or you're asked to make a critique of something, well, right off the bat, you have a very simple critique of saying, well, what is the unemployment rate? What is the true rate? Because, which, in other words, what you would say is, let's say someone writes a report and says, talking about unemployment, right off the bat you can say, well, which rate are you picking and why did you pick it, and is it the most appropriate rate at hand, right? So in other words, there could be, so what I'm trying to say is, if someone cites one number, you could say, well, why didn't you cite the other 7, right? Is there any particular reasons as to why, and then explore that as a potential angle of attack when you're doing your argument. Okay, so that's why. So for instance, let me just cover this. Like R1, for instance, means counting only those unemployed for 1 year or more. Okay? Whereas if you go to R2, so it goes a little bit higher, it's counting only those unemployed 3 months or more. Right, so you can see how R1 is sort of capturing the essence of sort of a longer term unemployment. Right, like R3, for instance, is we take the Canadian statistics and we make them comparable to American statistics, because there's also differences across countries. That could be another thing if you're ever reading any articles. Because I'm thinking back to when I was an undergraduate studying to a course in American history, business history, and that could be another issue, because we were looking at unemployment rates in the United States. Is that right off the bat you can make an argument, well, can I compare numbers across countries? And have you used the correct statistics that allow for this comparison? Right? Because if you don't measure using the same definitions, then what you're effectively doing is comparing apples against oranges. So that would be a fallacy, of course. Right? So you need to have these numbers adjusted. Of course, the reason why we're comparing to the United States is because the Canadian economy is so actively intertwined with America. I mean, that's why it's good to, it makes sense to compare Canadian numbers to American numbers, right? But I'm saying, let's say you want to compare Canada to Japan or Canada to the UK. You need to make sure that the definitions that you're using across the comparisons are all the same. If they're not, then you have a fallacy. And if the author of the paper you're reading hasn't made those adjustments, or hasn't looked into that issue, then that could be a beautiful attack for a critique, is that you're not making a fair, reasonable comparison. Okay? And so on. R4 is the official Canadian rate. And then there are other ones, R5, 6, 7, and 8. It's not important that you know that what all these are. I mean look at R8 for instance. Official rate. Okay, so that's R4. Plus discouraged workers, those waiting for recall, so you've been temporarily laid off. Those waiting for replies, right, from an employer, and long-term future starts, and the underutilized portion of involuntary part-time workers. I'm not going to ask you on a test to memorize that and remember that. I mean that's so ridiculously unnecessary. But the point is that there's all these different measures that are trying to capture different essences, different nuances of unemployment. And it's important, like for instance, let's say I was a politician in 1998 and I was, unscrupulous. And I would say, I'm a great, Neil, re-elect Neil. He's awesome. And I cite the R1 measure. Say it's only 1.1%. I mean, like, what more do you want from me, right? So you could see how someone who's not completely above board might try to manipulate this and pick the one that, or let's say I'm the politician now, let's say for the opposition parties, I might be inclined to say, look at the R8, 11.5%. This, that Neil, he's horrible and he can't manage the economy if his life depended on it. Don't elect him, elect the other guy, kind of thing. Okay, so that's why you have to know, in other words, you can't just take the number as given. You have to know, well, how did that number come into being? Okay, what exactly is it measuring? Okay, so that this raises some very important questions is of measurement and also of comparability across countries. Okay, so you have to make sure that the definitions are similar, or there's been some sort of adjustments have been made to make them as close possible. So you're comparing apples to apples to apples to apples, not apples, oranges, peaches, plums, and pears, because then of course it's not a legitimate comparison, and then you get yourself into trouble. Okay, so that's what I wanted to point out. I mean, this is not a bad thing to have. Okay, I mean, having these different measures obviously provides different nuances, right, and captures different things and could be used for different purposes. That's the whole point. I mean, the reason of having these different numbers is that they serve different purposes. I mean, this is actually a good thing. I'm just saying you could see how this could be abused either by ignorance, by not knowing that there's all these different 8 measures, and so not knowing what you see a piece of paper and someone writes down 7.3%. Well, what does that mean? So you may not know. And also this comparability across countries, which is an important issue now, especially in if you're thinking about globalization, if you're doing international trade, that's across countries and so on. That's why this becomes important. Okay, so that basically covers that. I think that's the coolest thing when I read that. Anyway, so that takes care of agenda numero uno. And so now in the next clip, I'm coming back and I'm going to look at these 4 different types, if you like, of unemployment.